My name is Naomi Calder, and I was 35 years old when my fiancé's family invited 80 people to watch them prove I was beneath them. It happened during our rehearsal dinner at the Bellamy Yacht Club, beneath a ceiling painted with ships their ancestors claimed to have owned. When my future mother-in-law placed a cream-colored contract beside my plate and announced, "Before Daniel marries this woman, she will sign away any claim to the Bellamy estate." Then she looked directly at me and added, "A sensible woman should be grateful for the opportunity. An opportunist should be exposed." The room went silent. Daniel's sister uncapped a fountain pen and pushed it toward my hand. My fiancé stared at the table. His father gripped his wine glass so tightly I thought the stem might snap. They believed I operated a small repair company out of a rented garage. They believed the battered van I drove represented my entire life. They believed I had hidden my ambition because I was ashamed of it. They had no idea that the slim leather portfolio resting beneath my chair contained an audited valuation of everything I owned, a second prenuptial agreement, and one page that would force every person in that room to decide which family was actually marrying for money. By the end of the evening, the rehearsal dinner was over. The country club wedding had been canceled, and Daniel's mother was staring at a signature line she would have given anything to make disappear. To understand why I did not throw the contract in her face, you need to know why I spent most of my adult life pretending success had happened to someone else. I founded Calder Power Systems 13 years earlier with a used service van, a borrowed voltage tester, and $600 left after rent. We installed backup generators and maintained emergency electrical systems for hospitals, senior communities, water treatment plants, and distribution centers. When storms knocked out power, my crews were the people driving toward the dark. By the time I met Daniel, we employed 112 technicians across 4 states. I owned the main operations facility, 3 warehouses, a training center, and a portfolio of commercial property purchased slowly whenever the company had a strong year. Our largest hospital contract alone was worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. None of that changed how I dressed. I still wore work boots to inspect sites, carried tools in the back of my van, and ate lunch beside my crews when a job ran late. I did not hide money because I enjoyed secrets. I hid it because I had watched money ruin the temperature of a room. The first boyfriend who learned what my company was worth began calling my accountant with ideas. A cousin I barely knew asked me to guarantee a loan 2 days after congratulating me. Friends who once split checks evenly suddenly forgot their wallets. Every disclosure turned relationships into negotiations. Eventually, I learned to answer questions with technically honest fragments. I own an electrical service company. I drive a van. Work is steady. People heard modesty and stopped calculating. I called that privacy. In truth, it was fear wearing sensible shoes. The person who taught me how to build was my Aunt June. My father disappeared before I started school, and my mother spent most of my childhood moving between unstable jobs and men who promised stability but delivered noise. Aunt June took me in when I was 14. She repaired industrial motors in a shop behind her house and could diagnose a burned winding by smell. She kept a brass measuring tape clipped to her belt, its casing dented from 30 years of drops. Whenever I complained that other girls inherited homes, jewelry, or family names, she would pull out that tape and say, "Measure what you can make, Naomi. Never measure yourself by what somebody else was handed." She died when I was 21. The shop was rented. The machines belonged to her employer, and her bank account barely covered the funeral. What she left me was the brass tape. I carried it in my first van, then my second, then the glove compartment of every vehicle after that. It was in my pocket when I signed the lease on our first warehouse. It was beside me when the bank approved the line of credit that saved the company during a brutal winter. For years, I kept it hidden, like a private relic. I understood later that I treated my success the same way. I was proud of it only when nobody was looking. I met Daniel Bellamy during a citywide outage caused by an ice storm. He was the director of a public history museum, and its archive building had lost power with a collection of temperature-sensitive photographs inside. My crew arrived at 2 a.m. with a temporary generator. Daniel stayed outside carrying extension cables even after I told him 3 times to go somewhere warm. He wore an old wool coat with one cuff repaired by hand and apologized to every technician he accidentally blocked. At 4, while we waited for the system to stabilize, He brought coffee and asked why the name Calder was stamped on all the equipment. "It's mine," I said. "Small company?" he asked. The old instinct answered for me. "Something like that." He did not ask about revenue, clients, or how many people worked for me. He asked whether emergency work ever became normal and whether normal was dangerous. It was the first conversation I had ever had in a loading bay about the moral cost of competence. We argued until sunrise. 3 days later, he called to ask whether I wanted dinner. 2 years after that, he proposed in the same archive building beneath a photograph of the town before electricity. Daniel came from the Bellamys, a family whose name appeared on plaques, scholarship funds, and a wing of the museum he directed. Their ancestors had owned shipping warehouses along the river. His mother, Eleanor, chaired the Preservation Foundation. His father, Charles, occupied boards he rarely spoke on. His older sister, Meredith, ran charitable events with the intensity of a military campaign. Daniel had deliberately stepped away from their world. He taught school before joining the museum, lived in a narrow townhouse, and considered any room with assigned seating suspicious. "My family thinks history belongs to whoever can afford the frame," he once told me. "I spend my life trying to prove the people outside the frame were there too." I loved that sentence. I mistook it for evidence that he could confront the people who had taught him otherwise. The first time I visited Bellamy House, Eleanor studied my work coat, my van, and my unpolished hands. "Daniel says you repair generators," she said. "We build and maintain emergency power systems." How industrious. She pronounced the word as though it explained why I had arrived through the service entrance. During dinner, Meredith asked whether my work was seasonal and whether I rented my equipment. I gave her incomplete answers because the questions felt less like curiosity than inventory. Eleanor asked which technical school I had attended. When I told her I had begun as an apprentice and later earned engineering certifications at night, she smiled. How wonderfully unconventional. Every compliment placed me one level lower. Daniel squeezed my knee beneath the table but said nothing. On the drive home, he apologized for their stiffness. "They're protective of the family," he explained. "Of what?" I asked. He laughed, but not comfortably. "The name, mostly." I should have noticed the word mostly. Bellamy House looked impressive from the road, but up close, the stonework needed repair. 2 rooms remained closed for restoration that never seemed to begin. Silver disappeared from the dining room between visits. A portrait of Daniel's great-grandfather vanished from the library and was replaced by a mirror slightly too small for the faded rectangle behind it. The family still hosted elaborate dinners, but the flowers became artificial, the wine less familiar, and the servants fewer. Their social authority remained intact because authority survives facts longer than money does. I did not understand the full picture until I entered Charles's study by mistake while searching for a powder room. On the desk lay a refinancing notice, an auction catalog, and a letter marked Final Demand. A cabinet stood open behind it with empty spaces where antique ship models had once been displayed. I stepped back before touching anything. As I closed the door, I heard Eleanor speaking from the adjoining sitting room. "If Daniel marries her without protection, she will make a claim the moment she realizes what the name is worth." Meredith replied. "Do we know she has anything of her own?" Eleanor's answer came immediately. "Of course she doesn't. Women with real assets don't arrive in service vans." I stood in the hallway with Aunt June's measuring tape inside my coat pocket. For the first time, the family's contempt made complete sense. They were not guarding wealth. They were guarding the appearance of wealth. Their fortune had become a stage set, and I was useful as the villain because every audience looks away from missing scenery when someone shouts thief. I could have told Daniel what I saw. I could have exposed the debts or asked whether his family expected him to rescue the house. Instead, I kept quiet, partly because the papers were not mine to reveal, but mostly because I still wanted Eleanor's approval. That is the humiliating truth. I had built a company from nothing, negotiated with hospital executives and state officials, and survived years when one equipment failure could have ended everything. Yet around Daniel's family, I became a teenager waiting to be told I could remain. I believed patience might turn tolerance into affection. Each dinner proved the opposite. Eleanor corrected my pronunciation of a French wine I did not order. Meredith asked whether my employees were helpers. When I suggested inviting several of my senior technicians to the wedding, Eleanor said the yacht club had capacity limits and that professional associates might feel uncomfortable among family friends. Their family friends numbered more than 100. My people were reduced to 8 seats near the kitchen. Daniel disliked the decision but asked me not to force the issue. After the wedding, none of this matters, he said. Let her have the event. It's our wedding. I know. But resisting her turns everything into war. And surrender turns it into what? He had no answer. Daniel loved me sincerely in private. He listened, cooked, remembered small things, and never asked me for money. But whenever his mother entered the room, his courage changed shape. He believed peace meant avoiding the sentence that needed to be spoken. One evening, after Eleanor introduced me as Daniel's practical little electrician, I told him directly that I would not continue being insulted. He said she needed time. I asked how much. He rubbed his face and said, "Just don't give her a reason to believe you're hostile." I realized then that his mother's hostility was treated as weather, while my reaction to it was considered a decision. Still, I stayed. I wanted the man from the archive at 4 a.m. I wanted the future he described when nobody else was listening. 3 weeks before the wedding, Daniel arrived at my house carrying a thick ivory envelope. He placed it on the kitchen table and said his family requested a prenuptial agreement. I was not offended by the concept. I had already asked my attorney, Renee Park, to prepare one protecting Calder Power Systems, my properties, and the trusts established for several longtime employees. Fair agreements are not insults. They are clarity written before conflict. The Bellamy document was something else. It stated that any enterprise, property, investment, or financial interest brought into the marriage by either spouse could be transferred into the Bellamy Family Holdings Trust at the trustee's discretion. It limited my rights to marital property, waived support under nearly every circumstance, and required disputes to be handled by a lawyer who already represented Eleanor. The agreement did not include financial disclosure from Daniel or his family. It gave me 5 days to sign. "Did you read this?" I asked. Daniel looked away. "Meredith's attorney says it's standard. It allows their trust to claim my company. They think your company is small. That makes it acceptable." "No, but practically nothing will happen. We're not going to divorce." I pushed the document toward him. "Then why does your mother need ownership rights over something she thinks has no value?" He became defensive, then tired. "Naomi, please. Sign it, and the pressure ends." "For whom?" He did not answer because we both knew. He was asking me to surrender on paper so he would not have to resist in person. That night, I removed Aunt June's tape from the drawer where I kept it and set it beside the Bellamy agreement. The brass case was scratched, ordinary, and real. The contract beside it was elegant, expensive, and dishonest. I understood that I had spent 2 years hiding the very evidence that would have shown these people how wrong they were. More importantly, I had hidden it from Daniel. I had never told him the company's full value. I had not lied, but I had designed the truth to be underestimated. That secrecy had begun as protection and become self-erasure. The next morning, I called Renee. We completed a full disclosure: company valuation, real estate, investments, retirement plans, insurance holdings, and liabilities. Everything was clear. Then we finalized my own prenuptial agreement. It protected both spouses' premarital property, required independent attorneys, prohibited either family from controlling marital assets, and included a generous but limited provision if one spouse left work to care for children. It was fair, because fairness is not the same as weakness. Renee also prepared a memorandum explaining why the Bellamy agreement was vulnerable. No disclosure, inadequate review period, conflicting representation, and visible pressure. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going to give Daniel one chance to choose truth before I choose for both of us." I showed him the memorandum but not my financial disclosure. I asked whether he would tell Eleanor the rehearsal dinner could not proceed unless the contract was withdrawn. He paced my kitchen for 20 minutes. Finally, he said, "Let's get through the dinner. I'll handle it privately afterward." "After they publicly pressure me?" "They wouldn't do that." "Are you certain?" His silence answered. 2 days later, Meredith mentioned casually, that the rehearsal dinner would include 80 guests, including foundation donors, club members, and everyone who matters to the Bellamy name. Then she smiled and said Eleanor planned a meaningful family welcome. I knew exactly what they intended. The contract was not meant to be signed in an attorney's office. It was meant to be signed beneath chandeliers while an audience watched, when refusal could be presented as proof of greed. They wanted shame to do what law could not. I decided I would attend. I did not plan revenge. I planned accuracy. If they placed a document in public, they would receive a public answer. The night of the dinner, I wore a dark green dress and carried a small black portfolio. Aunt June's measuring tape rested inside it beside the disclosures. The Bellamy Yacht Club occupied an old river terminal with white columns and windows overlooking the marina. The family insignia appeared on menus, napkins, and the lectern. Up close, the building revealed the same fatigue as their house: polished brass over cracked wood, dim lighting over stained carpet, artificial orchids arranged where fresh flowers once stood. Eleanor moved between tables in silver silk, greeting people as though the building belonged to her. Meredith monitored the room. Charles sat at the far end of the head table, quiet and pale. Daniel held my hand but barely spoke. Before the first course, Eleanor praised legacy, duty, and the sacrifices required to preserve a family across generations. After the main course, she rose again and asked for everyone's attention. Meredith placed the ivory contract in front of me. Eleanor's voice carried without effort. There is one matter we must settle before tomorrow. Naomi has been welcomed despite arriving without family standing, without social position, and without assets comparable to Daniel's inheritance. To protect what generations created, she will sign this agreement tonight. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Daniel whispered, "Mom, stop." Eleanor ignored him. She looked directly at me. Unless, of course, our concerns about her intentions are correct. Meredith uncapped the pen. "Sign it," she said. "Prove you are not here for the Bellamy money." 80 faces turned toward me. I picked up the pen. Eleanor relaxed. Daniel closed his eyes. Charles leaned forward. I opened the contract and began reading portions aloud. I read the clause allowing the Bellamy Trust to absorb premarital business interests. I read the waiver of independent counsel. I read the 5-day deadline and the requirement that disputes be handled by their lawyer. Then I asked Eleanor, "Where is Daniel's financial disclosure?" Her smile tightened. "That is private." "You're asking me to sign away everything I own without revealing what he owns. You have nothing worth discussing. Then why claim it?" The room changed. Eleanor had expected refusal, anger, or tears. She had not expected questions precise enough to make her document sound predatory. I placed the pen beside the unsigned line and opened my portfolio. "Since transparency matters," I said. I brought mine. I laid the first audited page on the table. I identified Calder Power Systems, its service regions, workforce, contracts, facilities, and equipment. I stated the conservative valuation. A guest near the front inhaled sharply. Meredith's face lost color. I listed the properties held by my company and the buildings owned personally. I disclosed investments and reserves without exaggeration. The combined figure was more than 12 times the value Eleanor had once implied the Bellamy estate possessed. Charles stood so quickly his chair struck the wall. He stared at the documents, then at me, because he understood the numbers and knew what remained in his own accounts. Eleanor looked toward him. "Sit down." He did not. "Is this accurate?" he asked me. "Every page is audited." He turned to Daniel. "Did you know?" Daniel shook his head. "Not the figures." Eleanor recovered enough to speak. Then she concealed this deliberately. "Yes," I said. "I concealed my wealth because I was tired of relationships changing when people saw it. You interpreted privacy as poverty, and poverty as guilt. I placed my own prenuptial agreement beside theirs. This agreement protects both Daniel and me. It requires disclosure, separate counsel, and equal treatment. I was prepared to sign it because I love your son. But I will not marry under public coercion, and I will not join a family that needs me humiliated before it can feel secure." Eleanor pointed at my documents. "You came here intending to shame us." "No, I came prepared not to be shamed. I could have revealed the refinancing notices, the auction catalog, and the empty study walls. I could have announced that the Bellamy fortune was mostly memory. I did not. Their debts were not mine to weaponize. I turned to Daniel instead. This is no longer about your mother. I asked you to stop this before tonight. You chose delay because her anger frightened you more than my humiliation. I love you, but I will not marry a man who calls silence peace while I am being dismantled beside him. I removed my engagement ring and placed it on the table between us. The sound was tiny, but everyone heard it. Tomorrow's wedding is canceled. On Wednesday morning, I will be at the county courthouse at 10. If you can stand beside me without asking me to disappear, come. We will marry with our own agreement and no audience. If you cannot, keep the ring and let this end honestly. Daniel stared at the ring. Eleanor said his name sharply, the command of a lifetime compressed into 2 syllables. For several seconds, he did nothing. Then he stood, walked around the table, and took my hand. His voice shook when he faced his mother. You called her a threat because you could not bear the possibility that she built more than we inherited. I let you reduce her because confronting you was harder than comforting her afterward. That ends tonight. Eleanor's expression cracked. You would abandon your family for this? Daniel answered, I am refusing to abandon the woman I asked to become my family. Charles lowered himself into his chair and covered his mouth. Meredith gathered the contract as though paper could still restore control. I picked up my portfolio and prepared to leave. Before I reached the door, Charles called my name. I turned. He looked at Eleanor, then at the guests, and finally at me. We had no right to ask for any of this, he said, and no fortune left that justified the performance. Eleanor went completely still. Charles had exposed the truth I had chosen to protect. Murmurs moved through the room. He continued, The house is mortgaged. The holdings are nearly gone. We sold the river property last year. This agreement was not protection. It was desperation dressed as tradition. Eleanor whispered, Charles. He shook his head. You called her a gold digger while trying to seize her company. That was the moment the Bellamy performance ended. Not because I destroyed it, but because the quietest person in their family finally stopped maintaining it. Daniel and I left together. Outside, the marina lights shook across the dark water. He apologized without defending himself. I told him apologies would matter only if his behavior changed when nobody was watching. He said he understood. No, I replied. You understand the sentence. Now you have to live the meaning. On Wednesday, I went to the courthouse at 10 carrying Aunt June's measuring tape in my bag. 2 of my senior technicians came as witnesses. Renee brought the fair agreement. At 10 minutes past 10, Daniel arrived wearing the repaired wool coat from the night we met. He had retained his own attorney, reviewed every provision, and signed only after making one addition. Neither spouse would ever be required to conceal success to preserve the other's comfort. We married in a plain room beneath fluorescent lights. Charles attended alone and stood in the back. Afterward, he shook my hand and said, Our family spent generations teaching people to admire what we inherited. You built something worth admiring. Eleanor did not come. I did not need her to. Bellamy House was sold the following spring. The yacht club removed the family insignia after unpaid pledges became public. Charles moved into a smaller home and began volunteering at Daniel's museum, cataloging records from workers whose names had never appeared on plaques. Meredith stopped speaking to us for almost a year. Eleanor sent one letter that blamed me for changing Daniel. I returned it unopened because not every accusation deserves a room inside you. Daniel kept his museum job. He entered therapy, learned how deeply avoidance had shaped him, and stopped treating conflict as evidence that love had failed. The first time Eleanor insulted me after our marriage, he ended the phone call before I spoke. It did not repair the rehearsal dinner, but it proved he understood what repair required. Calder Power Systems expanded into 2 more states. I replaced the dented van only when the transmission finally died. I began speaking openly about the company, instead of offering smaller versions of the truth. Some relationships changed exactly as I had feared. A few people asked for money. One friendship ended, but something better happened too. The people who remained were finally relating to the whole woman rather than the disguise she had designed for them. I mounted Aunt June's measuring tape in a glass case inside the training center, beside a small plaque containing her words, "Measure what you can make. Never measure yourself by what somebody else was handed." For years, I believed hiding my success protected me from being used. In reality, it trained me to accept relationships that required concealment. The Bellamys did not nearly take my company because they were powerful. They nearly took it because I wanted their acceptance badly enough to arrive as less than myself. That is the part I never forget. The contract was only paper. The real surrender had begun much earlier, every time I swallowed an insult, withheld a truth, or allowed Daniel's silence to substitute for loyalty. My worth was never created by the financial disclosure I placed on that table. The numbers simply forced the room to confront what it had refused to see. My worth had existed in every emergency call, every payroll met during a hard month, every apprentice trained, and every hospital kept running through a storm. It lived in Aunt June's brass tape long before any auditor wrote it down. So when people ask what I won that night, the answer is not Daniel, the courthouse wedding, or the shock on Eleanor's face. I won back the woman I had been editing for years. I picked up their pen, read their terms, and put it down without signing away my name. Sometimes that is the most powerful move available, not exposing every secret, not destroying the people who tried to diminish you, but standing at full height and refusing to help them misunderstand you for one more minute.